Here's how I sew a button fly. Here's what my pieces look like. You can see I've already put the buttonholes in and also finished the edge of the buttonhole placket. First up, I'm going to clip into the seam allowance about 1/2 inch shorter than the placket pieces. On the buttonhole side, I'm clipping into 3/4 of an inch. That's my seam allowance. But on the button side, I'm only doing 1/2 inch, and that's going to create a little bit of an overlap. And then I'm going to double turn the seam allowance on the buttonhole side, so turning and pressing at 3/8 of an inch, and then turning and pressing it again. And then from the wrong side, I'm going to stitch that fold into place, starting right where I clipped into the seam allowance. And then I'm going to position the buttonhole placket on the wrong side of the center front, just inside from that folded edge, and put a couple pins in to keep it in place. And then I can go ahead and top stitch that placket into place. I'm doing this first line of top stitching from the wrong side, making sure to stitch all the way into the seam allowance of the leg. And then I wanted to mimic the look of a double needle machine, so I'm going back in with a second line of top stitching from the right side. Moving on to the button side, I'm just closing up the bottom of the button placket, and then I'm going to turn and press that button placket so it's right sides out. And then I'm just pinning it to the front with the right sides together. And then I can go ahead and stitch that on. You can see I've pushed the seam allowance for the front side of the way, and below where I clipped into the seam allowance, I'm only stitching through the button placket. And then above where I clipped into the seam allowance, I'm sewing through all 3 layers. And then with the seam allowance pressed towards the side seam, I'm going to top stitch right along that edge. This will help deal with some of the bulk and make sure that everything is going in the right direction. I'm going to stop right where I clipped into the seam allowance. And then I can join the 2 halves of the fronts together. You can see I've got the button side facing right side up on the table, and I'm going to put the buttonhole side down on top of it. Just want to make sure that the center front is aligned there. Because of the way we sewed our seam allowances, it's slightly offset from the button side. Make sure that's all aligned, and make sure the waist is aligned as well. And then I'm just going to put in a couple pins to hold everything in place. And then starting right where I clipped into the seam allowance, I'm going to go ahead and sew that seam. I'm using a 3/4 inch seam allowance here. And then I'm going to trim the seam allowance of the buttonhole side in half or just under half. And then I'm going to turn and press the seam allowance from the button side over the trim seam allowance, stopping that edge just inside my first line of stitching. And then from the right side, with the folded seam allowance pressed towards the buttonhole side, I'm going to top stitch right along that seam. As I get closer to where the fly opens, I like to make sure that everything is aligned properly, and then I'm going to stop right where I clipped into the seam allowance or right above it. And then I'll turn the whole piece, and I'll take a couple stitches back and forth here just to reinforce this area before turning it again, and then continuing stitching, which should catch the other side of that folded seam allowance and finish off that flat felt seam. And that's how I sew a button fly. Let me know if you have any questions.